everybody. Welcome to Transforming Oral Histories, Harnessing the Power of Chicago's Japanese American Voices. My name is Emma Saito Lincoln, and I'm the Legacy Center Director for the Japanese American Service Committee in Chicago, Illinois. Before we get started, I'd like to thank the organizers of both Tadaima 2021 and Journey Chicago for including tonight's program in their schedules. We're honored to be included in both, and I hope that no matter how you found out about tonight's talk, you'll leave feeling excited about JASC's new digital exhibits and our efforts to activate the archives. Just so you know what to expect over the next hour or so, first, I'll be giving you a very brief overview of the larger project that enabled us to create the exhibits that we'll be focusing on tonight. Then I'll hand things over to Katherine Nagasawa, who is the real mastermind behind Uprooted and Reckoning. Kat is a former digital producer at WBEZ, which is Chicago's NPR affiliate station, and she's currently working as a digital producer for Full Spectrum Films, which is a Chicago-based nonprofit committed to driving equity in the independent film industry and educating the public about important social and cultural issues. After Kat has finished, I'll sum up briefly with some information about the TEACH Act that was passed recently in Illinois. There will be time for some Q&A at the end, so please feel free to type your questions into the chat and we'll address as many as we can. So let's start at the beginning. How did this project come into existence? In 2018, the Japanese American Service Committee had the extreme good fortune of receiving a grant from the National Park Service under their Japanese American Confinement Sites program. This grant funded a collaborative project between my organization, JASC, and the Chicago Japanese American Historical Society, CJAHS. For those who aren't familiar with the NPS JASC grant program, these funds are made available for projects that further the preservation or interpretation of U.S. sites where Japanese Americans were incarcerated during World War II. You may be wondering why organizations in Chicago received a grant when there were no incarceration camps here. And to understand that, you have to know that Chicago became a major resettlement hub as people were released from the camps and starting their lives over, with the population swelling to approximately 20,000 people in the post-war years versus less than 400 people of Japanese descent in Chicago prior to the war. To this day, the Japanese American community in Chicago has roots throughout the West Coast military exclusion zone and reflects experiences at all of the former incarceration sites. Next slide. There were many aspects of the grant project that we will not have time to go into tonight, but to give you some sense of the scope, I've listed out the key goals on this slide. On the oral history side, it encompassed digitization of pre-existing recordings, transcription, recording a substantial number of new interviews, and making content more accessible online. Additionally, the grant funded the 2 digital exhibits that Kat will be talking about, as well as curriculum development and teacher training workshops to enhance teachers' ability to incorporate this history into their classrooms. I do want to take a moment here to acknowledge the incredible work of our grant collaborators at the Chicago Japanese American Historical Society. In particular, Jean Mishima and Marlin Nishimura, who put countless hours into developing a comprehensive curriculum on Japanese American history. Despite the challenges of the pandemic, they were able to pivot from the original workshop plan and delivered 2 virtual teacher trainings this spring that were very well received by an audience of more than 50 teachers. Next slide, please. To provide a little more detail about JASC's oral history project, it's important to note that the interviews recorded as part of this grant were actually a continuation of a project that began in 2017. The interviews began under the direction of Anna Takada in conjunction with an exhibit called Then They Came For Me, which was held at the Alphawood Gallery here in Chicago. In 2018, Anna and the Oral History Project moved from Alphawood to JASC, and the grant we're discussing now began that summer, so summer of 2018. Altogether, interviews with over 100 individuals were recorded between 2017 and 2021. And if you're not familiar with the terms Nisei, Sansei, and Yonsei, those are the Japanese language terms for 2nd, 3rd, and 4th generation. As with so many things, We owe a debt of gratitude to our partners at CJAHS for helping Anna identify potential interviewees, and should also note that her work was, of course, informed by the earlier Regenerations Oral History Project led by the Japanese American National Museum, with CJAHS as their regional partner in Chicago. The Chicago Regenerations team included Jean Mishima, Mary Doi, Alice Murata, and others, and their work from the late 1990s sets a very high bar for those of us working in the oral history arena today. And with that, I'll hand things over to Kat to explain how she navigated from raw oral history interviews to the incredible multimedia sites she has produced for us.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emma, for giving that context on the Oral History Project. So today I'm going to go into depth about the process behind developing Uprooted and Reckoning, which were the two interactive websites that I built as part of that larger grant. So for Uprooted, it was to build upon the oral history project that Anna had started and develop an online exhibit that teaches Japanese American World War II incarceration history, as well as resettlement to Chicago. And sort of the two guiding questions for this exhibit that we hope to answer were, how did the experience impact people's identities, not just their personal identities, but also on their family members, their kids, grandkids, great-grandkids? And then also, what can we learn from this story about larger issues of racism, immigration, civil rights? We wanted to make sure that history was taught in a way so that students could make larger connections between incarceration history and current issues. Next slide, please. So we started with our key audience. I have a background in journalism, and so does our web developer, Paula Friedrich. And a lot of times when we're reporting a story, we ask ourselves, who is the intended audience for this story? And for this particular project, that audience is Chicago history teachers. We really wanted to start the process by going to them with some questions about how they taught history, when students are most engaged in history, and then also some practical considerations around classroom usage that would help inform the experience. So we put out a Google Form survey to Chicago area teachers and conducted some in-depth structured phone interviews with several of them, making sure that we had geographic diversity from all parts of the city as well as the suburbs. Some of the questions that we asked were around their teaching approach for history. So what are the main teaching tools do you use? Which ones have been most effective in your classroom? When are students most bored in your class, and when do they seem most engaged? And then also, have you used personal narratives or oral histories in your classroom before? And if so, what examples can you provide, and what format did you use to teach them? We also asked some technical questions around, if you're using multimedia or a web experience in the classroom, what parts work really well, and then also what parts are annoying or difficult to use. And again, as I mentioned, some of those practical constraints, we had to ask people, on average, how much time would you be willing to dedicate realistically to World War II incarceration in your classroom? And also, what kind of technology resources do students have access to? With the pandemic, though, digital access became much more widespread, and so access to Wi-Fi and laptops was less of a concern. If you go to the next page, some of the insights from those interviews, firstly, in CPS, which stands for Chicago Public Schools, U.S. history is generally taught during the junior year of school, and there actually is no standardized U.S. history curriculum. So everyone can create their own curriculum based on what they want to teach or what textbook their school uses. Additionally, all CPS schools should have Wi-Fi connection and laptop carts accessible for teachers to borrow out for their classes. In terms of time frame, most classes are around 50 minutes long, so anything we designed would have to fall within that 40 to 45-minute range to give teachers a little buffer on each end. And then as for teaching responses, overall, the themes that came through in the interviews were that students respond best to personal narratives, especially if it's from somebody who's around their age and is very relatable to them. Multimedia was also a huge plus. Students enjoy interacting with different mediums, whether that's audio, photo, video, etc. And then something that was really interesting to me was one teacher who said choice-based experiences was something that he noticed Gen Zers really enjoyed. The quote that he said was, "The more agency the kids have, the more bought in they'll be." Gave some examples about how kids can customize their Nike shoes these days, their shampoo. And so anything that has that sort of choose your own adventure type approach was very engaging for younger students. Another quote I wanted to highlight that I think any teachers in the audience would relate to is, "The less the teachers have to do, the more likely it is they'll use it." So trying to make the experience as frictionless as possible and not having the teachers do any extra work to find information on the website. So with that in mind, we had a better sense of what we needed to create. It had to be a 40 to 45 minute long experience, and then any supplemental materials had to be flexible in terms of the time needed. So think about it like an accordion. You can scale it up or down based on how much time you have. Obviously something that's very ready-made and easy to use, as well as functional across laptops, tablet, and phones. On our end, some considerations were production time for a small but mighty team, and then also the interest and availability of community members to participate as subjects. I also wanted to highlight a couple pieces that inspired us as we were thinking through format and might be also useful to others who are working on oral history adaptations. This example is from the Illinois Holocaust Museum. They did a hologram project where they flew 22 Holocaust survivors to a studio in LA that captured them with 360-degree cameras answering, I think it was more than 1,000 questions. And how that translated to the stage was that students would actually see the Holocaust survivor beamed onto the stage in 3D and were able to ask them questions almost in an Amazon Alexa or Google Home way, and that person would respond. And because they had recorded such a large database of questions and answers, it was fairly likely that a question you asked would be within that database. And I think the really shining part about this approach to teaching history is just how conversational and interactive they made history, especially given that a lot of Holocaust survivors are passing away. Having a hologram exhibit is a way to still make that history feel alive and very present. The next example is called Under Our Skin. It's a project on race by the Seattle Times. I think what we really loved about this example is just the element of choice. So there is no linear way to go through the website. You actually get to choose which issues you want to learn more about, whether that's institutional racism or microaggressions, and you get a custom experience based around that. And the next site I wanted to highlight is called Hyphen Nation. It's a project by POV and New York Times. I think what this does well is getting people to talk in very emotional ways about their identities and using hand-drawn visuals as a way to complement those stories. And that's something that we really took inspiration from, having hand-drawn elements, having illustrated elements integrated with video and photo. And finally, The Orange Story, which is produced by my new employer, Full Spectrum Features. The Orange Story follows a Japanese-American man who owns a business as he's preparing to leave his home, after this, the signing of his Executive Order 9066. And I think The Orange Story has a web companion to the short film. And it does a really good job of integrating educational elements throughout the entire site. So when Full Spectrum was developing this website, they were intending it for classroom use. So it was a great example for us as to how other places are thinking about integrating multimedia with classrooms. So based on our research and those pieces of inspiration, we came up with 3 different approaches for our website. The first is option A, which I call the Oral History Medley. I would say this is probably the most like your traditional textbook. You hear multiple different voices that highlight diversity of experience. And there's only one kind of way to navigate the website. Everybody gets the same kind of experience. And this is good, I think, for sort of a big picture history overview. The next option is following a specific character family. And this is where we really tried to incorporate that element of choice that one of those history teachers mentioned was really appealing. And in this one, you are able to choose a family to follow and get a customized experience centered around that particular family. And, there's that element of choice. And then also we hope that the students would have a deeper connection to that particular family by getting to know them well and following them from the West Coast all the way to Chicago. And then option C is very similar to option B, but it adds in one extra layer, which is the ability to interview a character or family member. And so there will be multiple questions that you can choose from, and you're able to queue up different videos based on those choices. So whereas options A or B might have videos interspersed throughout that all viewers watch, option C gives people the choice of which ones they want to consume and in what order. So what did we land on? We chose option C, where it's all based around a particular family, and it has that ask question feature in the videos. I think the pros of this approach is being able to, like I said, develop a deeper connection with a particular family and having those multiple levels of choice and interactivity built in. I think one of the cons is, not getting the breadth of experience that you would in an option A. But given the time constraints, we felt that it might be best to go narrow and deep first and hope that students are really engaged with these families, and that leads them to exploring the larger oral history collection from JASC and CJAHS. One other thing we were worried about with this format was, if we're focusing so much on family stories, will we not get the historical context that's really important for learning World War II history? And so how we tried to solve that was really being intentional about weaving the historical context into all of the family stories, and then also using key terms and supplemental resources as a way to expand on any gaps that we had. The next step in our process was selecting families to participate. And this is where I relied really heavily on Anna Takata, who is the oral history project lead. She had experience interviewing literally dozens of older Japanese Americans in Chicago over the course of multiple years. And so she had thought a lot about, persistent themes that came up, things that would feel representative of, that breadth of community experience, since we weren't going to be able to do that in this approach. Ultimately, that led us to 3 individuals, Minoru Imamura, Chiyoko Omachi, and Kazuo Ideno. And Anna chose them based on a couple factors. Some of them were age at the time of incarceration, gender, also comfort level with speaking, and interest in sharing their story more broadly in a public sense. And she also was thinking about some core themes. So for Minoru Imamura, the theme that she felt his story really captured well was military service during World War II. He was part of an army unit that practiced with, that trained with the 442nd. Although he did not end up serving in the 442nd, he trained as a replacement for the 442nd. And his story also really hits on the very controversial loyalty questionnaire that was administered in camp. Chiyoko Omachi, her story really represents the experience of somebody who left camp early for student leave. This was an early leave clearance that was granted to younger Japanese Americans to complete high school and college in the Midwest and on the East Coast. And then Kazuo Ideno, his family experienced family separation when his dad was taken to a Department of Justice camp because he was a kendo instructor in San Francisco's Japantown. Kazu's story also touches on the resettlement community on the south side of Chicago. His family ran a Japanese American boarding house. So these are the surface level themes, but as I had time to get to know all of these individuals, there became underlying themes that kind of came through the cracks. And I hope that these themes also come through in the final stories. For Min, that would be using pilgrimage to the former campsite he was incarcerated at as a form of remembrance and healing for his family. For Chiyoko, that would be using her voice and also the written word to tell other people about the Japanese American story and fight to protect civil liberties of other communities. And then for Kazuo, there was a lot of loss of Japanese language and culture that he experienced due to the intense pressure he felt to assimilate once he was in Chicago. And this was all a result of that incarceration and resettlement experience. So once we had our three main subjects, I was mapping out the stories using those oral history recordings that Anna had done. So she had done very long, extensive oral histories with each of those grandparents, and that helped me informing a timeline of their lives and also a thematic map for follow-up questions or things that we could explore further. And the way that I divided up the stories is into 5 chapters, where the first 3 chapters really focus heavily on the grandparents' experience living on the West Coast before World War II, their experience with forced removal and incarceration, and then their resettlement to Chicago. And then chapter 4 and 5 would focus more on the children's and grandchildren's experience growing up in Chicago. The fun part was next, conducting video interviews and spending time with all of these families. Because of the specific format we were doing with the question and answers, I re-recorded video interviews and used a green screen and had each of the subjects talk directly to the camera. And the thought behind this is to make it as immersive as possible and as conversational as possible. So when you see the final videos, it should look as if each person is talking directly to you from within the web page. So these are the Idenos. I actually didn't include every family member that I interviewed in the final piece, but every interview I did was really instrumental in giving me a sense of the family story. And the interviews that were not included in the final piece will still be part of that larger oral history collection that will be available online. So those are the Idenos. Second family is the Imamuras with Min in the middle, his 2 daughters, Carrie and Gail, on top, and then 2 granddaughters, Annika and Kara, along the bottom. And last but not least, the Omachis, Chiyoko on the left, Teresa in the middle, and Chris, the grandson, on the right. And one other thing to note about these video interviews, it's not like a traditional oral history where we're capturing their entire life. A lot of the focus of these video interviews was very specifically trying to get at some of the themes that I had mapped out in those the slide with the chapters. And so in these interviews, I tried to focus more on the emotional experience of incarceration and resettlement as opposed to getting all of the details, because my thought was that we could accomplish some of the details and information in the story text, but the videos would be the most effective medium for conveying anything that is related to an emotional experience. Another element to the process of producing this was gathering a lot of personal family archival photos from each of the families and pairing that with historical photos that gave a little bit more of that context. So here's an example from Chiyoko's story. She has this beautiful family photo of her dad who worked in a Japanese shipbuilding facility on Terminal Island on the left. And then on the right, you see a historical photo of the FBI roundup on Terminal Island after Executive Order 9066 was signed. Another example comes from Kaz's story. There's a really cute photo of him and his younger brother sumo wrestling at Crystal City, which is a Department of Justice detention camp in Texas. And on the right, you see a historical photo showing an aerial view of that same camp. And thirdly, this is Min and a couple of his friends at Camp Amachi, located in Grenada, Colorado. And on the right, you see a larger, wide photo of the rows of barracks at that camp. And I think this pairing really helps place Min, Chiyoko, and Kaz within the historical context while still maintaining the fact that this is a personal story. But I think that, that personal element was really important to keep as a through line throughout. And yeah, exactly. Building on that, I think that the personal photos that we did collect are irreplaceable and do a really great job of making students really feel like, this is somebody's childhood or this is somebody's life. This is not just a a textbook or something that's abstract. Here are some photos from Kaz's childhood in Chicago. On the left is his mom and a couple of the boarders from their boarding house, just hanging out on the shore of Lake Michigan in Jackson Park. On the right is Kaz and his baseball team, which mostly consists of other Japanese American teens who resettled to Chicago. Later on in Kaz's life, he studied to become a teacher at University of Illinois at Chicago. So on the left, you see him with his classmates. And then on the right, you see his daughter, Karen, growing up in the suburbs, celebrating her birthday. And finally, Kaz's grandson, Ryan, grows up going to the Obon Festival with his grandpa in Chicago. And on the right, you see the two of them volunteering at the Ginza Festival, which happens every summer at Midwest Buddhist Temple. So these all just add so much more depth and dimension to the stories, being able to see Kaz grow over a lifetime and then also get to meet his family. Another element of producing this piece was developing a visual identity for it. And we had the great privilege of being able to hire an illustrator to actually help us with illustrations and artwork for this project. So we worked with Corey Nakamura Lin. She's a Taiwanese, Japanese American artist who grew up in Chicago, and her story actually mirrors a lot of the stories that we focused on for Uprooted. Her family resettled to Chicago after World War II, and her grandpa was actually incarcerated at the same camp as Min. They actually knew each other. So I think for her, this project was very personally meaningful, and she brought a lot of her own lens and her own family experience to conversations around visuals, which I think made them so much stronger. So some questions that we were considering in the early conversations around visual identity is, just how can visuals help us really reinforce some of those main themes we want students to take away? And also, how can visuals convey parts of stories that we don't have photos for, where we have gaps in visuals for? I think after discussing this, Corey landed on visuals that were Japanese inspired, colorful, very hand-drawn and textured. So here are a couple examples for each of the characters of sort of visual motifs that we came up with. For Min, broccoli fields. He left a broccoli farm in Anaheim when he was going to camp. Military gear for his service during World War II, and then floral arrangements. He was a florist in Chicago after he resettled. For Chiyoko, she grew up on Terminal Island, so there was a lot of visuals around surfboards, the ocean. She also was a journalist and also a storyteller, so sheets of paper to represent her interest in writing. And then Kazuo, a lot of his story focused around how incarceration changed his relationship to Japanese culture, whether that be kendo or calligraphy. And so we were kind of playing around with concepts of barbed wire and different cultural elements. So here's an example for how Corey translated some of these ideas into actual visuals for Chiyoko's story. She did a beautiful portrait of her based on a photo, and then she pulled these themes of ocean, writing, civil liberties into small illustrations that are featured throughout the story. And what I love about these is that she really pulls from specific details. So Chiyoko talks about how her dad made her a little surfboard that she would ride on the beaches of Terminal Island. And on the top right, you do see a little Chiyoko with her surfboard. So that's not something we have a photo of, but Corey did such a good job of visually representing it in her illustrations. And on the landing pages for each of the character stories, we feature that portrait along with a quote that really sort of captures the main theme and takeaway of that particular person's story. So for Chiyoko, that would be, we have to do everything we can to fight for the civil liberties of others, and that starts with telling our story. And this quote is something that we workshopped directly with her and made sure that it felt like something that really embodied the message she wanted to share. And then finally, Corey also designed these gorgeous chapter headings that help set the stage for each of the different chapters of Chiyoko's life. So if you look at the top left, she's leaving her home in Terminal Island in California. In chapter 2, at the top, she arrives in Poston and ends up starting a student newspaper to report on teen life and camp. On the right, she actually takes early leave to finish high school on the East Coast and gets in an argument with her principal about whether she is Black or white, and she consistently pushes back, "I'm neither, I'm Asian," which I think really represents, her personality and her persistence. That's a through line in her life. And then in the bottom, you see her passing along a civil rights book to her daughter. This is the chapter that really focuses on Teresa, her daughter's story, and Teresa's experience as a lawyer, focusing on constitutional law, which is inspired by her mom's work. And then finally, at the bottom left, you see Chiyoko speaking to the middle school of her granddaughter or grandson, Chris, and his experience seeing his grandma share her story. Something else I wanted to highlight before I demo the site is just how we were thinking about building in educational elements and providing some of that context that I mentioned earlier. One way we did that was through key terms and definitions. So if you hover over certain terms, it'll actually show you a definition. And then also for each of the character stories, we have a tab called Classroom Resources that include supplemental readings and viewings based around the themes for each of the families. And so for Kazuo, a lot of the supplemental resources focus around the WRA's resettlement process. For Chiyoko's, a lot of it focuses around the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 and the redress movement. And then for Min's story, the supplemental materials focus on the loyalty questionnaire and different aspects of military service during World War II, whether that's the 442nd, draft resistors, or the No-No Boys. In addition to this, if you go back one slide, we also held those 2 teacher training workshops this past spring that feature the larger CJAHS curriculum, which includes a chapter on Uprooted. And this was led by Jean Mishima and Marlene Nishimura. And this actually goes much broader than the scope of Uprooted. It starts with the roots of anti-Asian legislation pre-World War II, and then it goes all the way to the present, making connections. And so Uprooted is intended to sort of fit as the middle chapter of that larger curriculum. So finally, putting it all together, we're going to do a quick walkthrough of the site. I think Emma might also link to the site in the chat so people can peruse at their leisure. Just a heads up that both of the sites I'm showing you today are still in demo form. They're not fully formed. There's still elements that are missing. So please forgive us if there are glitches or certain things that aren't fully complete. But if you want to just click begin, there is an introduction where you get to meet those 3 individuals, learn a little bit about Executive Order 9066 and the forced removal, and then learn about resettlement to Chicago and actually get to see the family members that you can explore. So once you click Follow Family, it takes you to the Choose page, and this is where students are able to pick which family member they want to follow. It also includes a little bit of a tease of what the stories are about, as well as the ability to quote unquote meet their families. If you click on that button, you get to see each family member and learn a little bit more about which generation they are. And if you click Read Chiyoko's Story, I'll just do a really brief walkthrough. Here you see that beautiful landing page that Corey designed. And then you start at that first chapter where Chiyoko is living on Terminal Island as a teenager and World War II starts. So it's a combination of her family photos, discussion questions, key terms, historical photos. And at the very end of each chapter is where you have the ask feature. And so Chiyoko looks like she's kind of waiting for you to ask her a question. So students can choose between those different questions. Maybe we'll do what was it like growing up on Terminal Island, and you can hear from her.
Well, it was just the beach and the roaring of the sea, and at night on moonlit nights, it was very romantic, I think. And we would sit up there and sing songs. A very lovely childhood, I think. It's too bad, we couldn't have grown up there. It was disrupted and we had to leave because of the war. But I often think, I go back to those days and I think that was a very lovely place to be, you know.
Cool. And then she goes back to waiting for you to ask the next question. And then as you go through the full story, chapter 2 and 3 focuses on Chiyoko, and then chapters 4 and 5 focus on her daughter Teresa and her grandson Chris. So I know we don't have a ton of time, so I'll let you all explore this at your own leisure later on. But that's a little preview of it. Next, I am going to talk about the process for developing Reckoning, which was the second web experience that was part of that larger oral history grant. Oh, I know it's tricky to get back in after present mode. I think if you go to the slide before that. Awesome. Okay. So for this particular exhibit, it was a pretty similar goal. It's a teaching tool, but focusing on the Chicago Japanese Americans' role in the fight for redress and reparations in the 1980s. And sort of our guiding questions for this exhibit was, how did the redress experience impact people's identities? And then also, this year, and actually this month, is the 40th anniversary of the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, or CWRIC, hearings that happened in Chicago. It's the 40th anniversary. And so on this anniversary, reflecting on the redress movement, what can we learn from that story about other movements for reparations and social justice today? So kind of maintaining that link to other communities and other issues. Very similar to Uprooted, we had similar classroom constraints for time. Also wanted it to be as seamless and easy to use as possible. I think with this particular history, because it is very specific and not related to World War II incarceration as directly, we're imagining it might be used more often within a college context, maybe within a civil liberties class or an Asian American studies classroom as well. Same considerations for making sure it's functional across devices and thinking about time and participation. When we were thinking about format for this one, we came back to those 3 options that we had come up with for Uprooted. I think for the redress story, it seemed to not really fit that same multi-generational family focus that worked really well for Uprooted. But when we were thinking back onto the oral history medley, it seemed to be a better fit for that, since there are multiple perspectives on the movement as opposed to having one particular narrator throughout. So we ended up taking this approach where we featured multiple voices and a combination of photos, text, archival elements, etc., to provide a bigger overarching history view. So mapping out the story, I spent a ton of time digging through the archives at JASC and JCL Chicago's office. There were a lot of personal documents, letters, newsletters that were really helpful in piecing together the story. I also wanted to shout out the Northeastern Illinois University archives because they recently made all of the videos and transcripts from the CWRIC hearings available on their Digital Commons website. And that was absolutely essential to doing this work, being able to actually watch those testimonies and read the transcripts. They're a really powerful set of videos, and I encourage anybody who's interested in redress history, especially local redress history, to check them out. So as I did a lot of research and reading, I sort of came up with 5 chapters that would span, the earliest interest and movement for redress and reparations, all the way up to the Chicago Japanese American community's role in racial justice and reparations movements today. So with this, I really wanted to be able to tell that larger redress story, but localize it to Chicago because that was, the purpose of the grant, to really highlight Chicago voices and the Midwest perspective on this history. So that next step was selecting speakers. one caveat is that many people were involved in the national movement for redress, but I specifically focused on Chicago voices for the purposes of this exhibit. And secondly, a lot of the people that I hoped to interview have unfortunately passed away. So I went with people who were still in town and available and willing to speak. One of those main voices is Bill Yoshino, who's on the left. He was the Midwest director of the JACL during the redress years and for many decades afterwards. And he was very crucial in this formation of the exhibit, in speaking to the larger campaign strategy for redress in the Midwest and how it was executed. Ross Harano was another voice featured. He was involved in JCL Chicago, and he was also very active in Chicago and Illinois politics. I think he really did a good job speaking to some of the lobbying that was necessary, as well as interracial coalition building efforts that were really necessary for getting general buy-in from the public for redress and reparations. Another voice that is featured is Mary Sampson. She's a member of the NCJAR Chicago chapter. This was another organization that grew in addition to JCL Chicago that was advocating for redress. NCJAR actually took more of a judicial approach, so they filed a class action lawsuit as opposed to pushing for redress legislation. And so Mary really speaks to the motivations for that lawsuit. And then finally, there are a couple other voices featured. I know I said that not all of the people I wanted to interview were alive, but luckily the work of other oral historians and historians really helped in this process. So Chie Tomihiro is one of those people. She was the chairperson of the Chicago JCL chapter's redress committee. She was also a former JCL Chicago president who really led the witness recruitment process and spoke very directly to the hearings experience. So I was able to find an oral history with her through Densho, which is an online repository of archival material around Japanese American history. And so I was able to feature her voice, even though she has passed away. And then the last two voices that are featured are Jane Kaihatsu, who was the JCL chapter president during the redress movement years. She really spoke to the impact of the movement on the Japanese American community's ability to kind of share and educate the larger public about incarceration. And then finally, Lisa Doi, who is the current JCL Chicago president. And Lisa spoke a lot to how the community today is making connections between World War II incarceration history and broader patterns of racial injustice, and also about the community's role in current modern day reparations efforts for other communities. Here's just some shots from connecting the video interviews. Similarly to Uprooted, used a green screen and had people speak directly into the camera, so it felt very conversational and sort of engaging and interactive. And then also similar to Uprooted, I think that combination of personal photos and historical photos really help tell that local history and make it feel more personal. So one thing I really wanted to highlight on the left is a screenshot from a video of one of, I believe, the earliest Chicago pilgrimages to the former sites of Jerome and Rohr incarceration camps. And I was able to take this screenshot from some footage that Ross donated to the Southside Home Movie Project in Chicago. He had a lot of extra rolls of film reels in his house. One of them was of this pilgrimage. And so, part of the Reckoning story talks about the role that pilgrimages played in really activating Sansei around redress and also educating them about the camp experience for the first time. And so I think having an actual photo of the Chicago community on a pilgrimage really just makes that come to life in a new way. And then on the right is a photo that you often see in books and articles around redress. It's a historic photo of JCL redress committee members meeting with 4 Japanese American legislators in Congress. The personal photos were also irreplaceable in this exhibit as well. We had some great donations from Jane Kaihatsu and Mary Sampson that give you an inside look at some of the process, the not so glamorous process of lobbying and pushing for legislation. So on the left, you see a meeting in the JCL Chicago office. You see a younger Bill Yoshino with a map of the Midwest behind him, and they're discussing things over cans of Bud Light and old style, with piles of letters on their desk. And on the right, you see a photo of NCJAR members folding newsletters in somebody's basement. And the NCJAR newsletter was a main way that the organization communicated with their members. And so this was a nice kind of sneak peek behind the scenes look at how that happened. Another aspect of this process I wanted to highlight is just how many photos that we were able to unearth from film negatives and contact sheets that had not previously been digitized. So one in particular I think is really powerful is this photo on the left of some Japanese Americans in Chicago practicing their testimonies for the formal CWRIC hearings, recorded on videotape for them to watch back and give feedback on. And something we learned through this process of digitizing these photos is that the actual videotapes of the practices were held by JCL Chicago. So they have a whole stack of VHSs from those practice workshops that were in the process of getting digitized. So that's an outcome of this project. On the right, you see JCL Chicago members playing back some of those tapes, reviewing them and giving notes to the participants. So this also gives you a window into the process that went into the witness hearings that you might see in the Northeastern Illinois University archives. I think these photos that were from some contact sheets I found are extremely powerful. They're from JCL Chicago. And you do see these people in the videos from the hearings, but I think because these photos are in such so clear and so close up, it really conveys some of the emotional aspects of that day. And I think that they're just really gems that we were able to find and hopefully will become part of larger archival collections moving forward, since this is pretty recent history. Finally, another example of some photos we were able to unearth were from the JASC archives. And this is from a ceremony at Haywood Terrace, which is a senior living facility in Chicago, where Issei, or first generation Japanese American immigrants, were receiving their first redress checks. So they're all sitting in the lobby, and film camera crews were there for that distribution. For Reckoning, we also got to work with Corey again to develop a visual identity. I think that this was a particularly challenging task for her because the redress story is something that is both very technical, it deals with legislation and lobbying and paperwork, and it's also very abstract. There are a lot of themes like catharsis or healing or shame that are a little hard to capture in photos. And those were themes that we really wanted to come across in the visuals. And so she very expertly came up with this metaphor using color. And so the orb that you see in these various illustrations represents the Japanese American incarceration story. So if you look at the top right illustration, the Nisei parents are trying to sort of hide away that history in a chest. And in the next panel on the right, you see the Sansei kids discovering it for the first time and learning about that history. On the bottom left, you see that the logos for the 3 different organizations that were leading redress movements with little flames of the orb kind of representing how people became activated around this history. And then finally, on the right, you see Corey's representation of the CWRIC hearings in Chicago, where a woman is sort of releasing her story for the first time. And you see members of the audience with their own orbs, representing that they also have their own stories and that they're resonating with her. Here's some other examples of how Corey extended that metaphor from the process of awakening and learning the story for the first time to coalition building with other people and learning that other people are also interested in creating a movement around redress. The act of releasing a story with those plumes of smoke coming out from that woman at the podium, kind of working together to push for legislation. And then on the bottom right, seeing the Japanese American redress movement as one of many different movements for racial justice. For Reckoning, we also wanted to include educational elements. Just a note that these elements are actually still in process right now. We're finalizing them. So in the demo link, not all of the supplemental readings and viewings are available, but it's something we're working on. We have a very similar feature to Uprooted, where there are different key terms that you can click on and get larger context. And oftentimes we'll link out to a longer explanation on the Densho Encyclopedia, which is an incredible resource that gives a lot more historical context about Japanese American history. So putting it all together, here's another demo of how Reckoning works. I think Emma's also going to drop this link in the chat. So similar to Uprooted, there's a little bit of a scrolling experience that helps introduce the incarceration, the Civil Liberties Act, and movements today. And then when you click begin, it's also a chapterized experience. And if you just stay on that first illustration at the top, you'll see that Corey actually integrated movement into the illustration. So they're looping videos and there's motion, so you can kind of see how that orb is reacting or interacting with the other people in the shot. If you scroll down, we can demo how the key terms work. So let's say you're interested in learning about the 442nd, you can click on it and the definition will come up. And then similarly to Uprooted, you get to hear from different speakers throughout. So if you click here from Ross Hirano, he will
My first reaction
something.
was, wow, now I understand why I have a picture of me as a baby in front of a tar paper shack. Now I understand about the scars.
So I'll let you all peruse that more in depth, but just know that this is still a demo site, so not everything is finalized. Even the text isn't completely finalized at this point, but it'll give you a sense of how we try to weave in those different elements, the visuals, photos, and video into this experience. Cool. So I think now I might pass it off to Emma, who's going to talk a little bit more about legislation around teaching Asian American history in Illinois that actually is very recent and happened this past summer.
Thank you, Kat. I have to say, despite having been privy to this project's development over the past 11 months or so since I started working at JASC, of course, the project started years before that. It's still so wonderful to see Uprooted and Reckoning in their finished or nearly finished forms. But now we're getting short on time. And to cap things off, I'm going to highlight a very recent development. Sorry, I'm trying to get the right links into the right places for you. A development in Illinois that is especially relevant to Kat's amazing work. For those of you outside of Illinois, or perhaps less connected to the Asian American community in our state, you may not know that just this summer, a truly remarkable thing happened. And the Teaching Equitable American History, or TEACH Act, HB 376, was introduced this year, 2021, in January. It passed both houses of the Illinois legislature in May, and it was signed into law on July 9th. This major success was due in large part to the efforts of a group called Asian Americans Advancing Justice Chicago, and a broad coalition of organizations that came together to rally support for the bill. JASC, CJAHS, and the Japanese American Citizens League Chicago chapter were among the many members of that coalition. Next slide, please. So what does the TEACH Act do? And this act amends the Illinois school code to require that a unit on Asian American history be taught in all public elementary and high schools across the state. It specifies that this must include the history of Asian Americans in Illinois and the Midwest. The stated intent of the new requirement is that the studying of this material shall constitute an affirmation by students of their commitment to respect the dignity of all races and peoples and to forever eschew every form of discrimination in their lives and careers. The TEACH Act comes into effect during the 2022-2023 school year, and this means that teachers, many of whom were never taught this history themselves, will need to very rapidly acquire appropriate tools and resources to use in the classroom. To some extent, they can turn to high-quality national resources, such as the lesson plans available from PBS based on their Asian Americans documentary series, or from other Japanese American or Asian American national level organizations. However, in order to teach about Asian American history as it has played out in Illinois and the Midwest, they will need resources like Uprooted and Reckoning, not just from the Japanese American community, but also from the many other Asian American communities that call Illinois home. And I think you'll agree with me that, as Kat has demonstrated, it takes a tremendous amount of time and effort to create these types of resources, but the need for them has never been greater, especially in Illinois with this new legislation. And you can see from this slide, we have many, many, many people and organizations to thank for their contributions to this project. And apologies to anyone that I've missed. I'm fairly new to the project myself, and I missed out on the first 2 years of its development. So I do apologize if your name should be on here and it isn't. And I should also thank Kimiko Mar and Carolyn Kimura, who have been helping us today on behalf of Tadaima to run kind of behind the scenes for us to keep things running smoothly. So we don't have a huge amount of time left, and I don't believe I've seen any questions come through yet on the chat. If you do have questions for us, you can go right ahead and type those into the chat box on YouTube. I know that I was having a little bit of difficulty earlier with posting, so I had to hand off the links that I was trying to post to someone else to get them up there. So I hope that's not happening to our audience. But Kat, while we wait to see if anyone does have questions for you. Oh, here we go. We do have a question from Kelly Nagasawa. No relation, I suppose. What was the most challenging part about each project?
Ooh, good question, Kelly. That's my sister. I think for Uprooted, one of the challenging parts was the fact that it is a multi-generational story. And so, we're trying to capture not just the stories of the Nisei or Sansei, but also Yonsei and Gosei and subsequent generations. And I think that it was, challenging and inspiring to be able to try to weave all those themes together. And, obviously when you walk into a project like this, you don't know what the underlying themes are. You don't know what you're going to find and pull out in the story. So you have to sort of take a leap of faith in working with the families that different things will come through and be translated into this story. So I think just trying to make sure that those themes were consistent and woven through was challenging. I think for Reckoning, one of the challenges actually was because it was such recent history, a lot of the archival materials weren't actually readily available in different institutions that you might normally go to, like libraries and museums. A lot of the archival material that I ended up finding was in people's basements. It was, boxes of papers that their mom had saved and, the kids hadn't thrown away yet. And so kind of going through that almost like a treasure hunt process of trying to go into personal archives and dig through things that hadn't really been cataloged yet was time consuming, but also really rewarding as well.
And we should add that in a few cases, some of those folks were ready to relinquish some of those materials and have them transferred into an archives like our JASC Legacy Center, where they can be cataloged and made accessible. But for some families, they weren't ready yet, that these are very personally important materials. And I know my institution deeply respects that we don't push for people to give us things, but when they're ready, we are here and happy to make them accessible to researchers everywhere. I see another question here about the Japanese Latin American experience and whether that is represented in these projects.
No, so that experience is a super important part of learning about Japanese American incarceration history. Unfortunately, it isn't a focus of either of the exhibits. Although, in doing a lot of research, I did learn a lot more about Japanese Latin Americans being incarcerated at Crystal City, which was the camp that Kazuo's family was detained at. And so in some of his oral history interview, he talks about being alongside Japanese Peruvians in that camp and people from other backgrounds, including German Americans and or Germans and Italians. So there are parts of it that kind of overlap, but it doesn't go into deep depth around it. One other thing I learned during my research is that one of the organizations that isn't, very deeply profiled in Reckoning, it's called NCRR, National Coalition for Redress and Reparations. They did a lot of work around working with the Japanese Latin American community to push for redress for them, because that wasn't included in the 1988 Civil Liberties Act. So that's definitely something that I'm very interested in seeing more pieces go deeper into. I'm personally very curious about.
And while we give folks a few minutes more, we're coming up on the hour, but we are prepared to stay on. So if you have questions and you're holding back because you think we're coming to the end of time, please feel free to get your questions in. But Kat, I was wondering if you have thoughts about what future projects might be in store for you, or that you hope JASC or another JA organization might pursue.
Yeah, I think in doing the research for Reckoning, I just kept thinking to myself how incredible of a feature film it would be to do a film about that whole redress process. There's just so much, drama to it. There's a lot of behind the scenes work that happened with political lobbying. There's a lot of community organizing on a grassroots level. So I would love to see a fictional film be made about redress. I don't know if I would necessarily be the one directing it, but I would support them in any way possible. In addition to that, I do think that what that other person, I'm not sure what his name is, B. Nakashima, said about the Japanese Latin American experience is something I also think is incredibly important to tell, especially given that a lot of the survivors of those camps are now probably in their late 80s and 90s. Now more than ever is the right time to be capturing those histories. And as somebody who, speaks some Spanish, I would also be very interested in kind of getting to know some of the Japanese communities in both Peru and Brazil that kind of came up as part of the Japanese diaspora, not just about their incarceration during World War II, but just about that culture and the history of those specific places.
I think I hear a future grant proposal in that potential project. Well, we are at the end of our time, and I don't see any last questions coming in. So I think we'll bring it to a close. And thank you, Kat, for giving us a real peek at the behind the scenes of how you created these sites. But also, this is, for folks who don't realize, this is the first public unveiling of both of these sites. So we really are so excited to have shared them with you. Of course, the teachers got to see an earlier draft version of Uprooted, but Uprooted has actually seen several important changes since then as well. So, so you were the first to see it, and now you have the links to go to both sites, and you can explore on your own.
Yeah, and I would just say, if any of you know U.S. history teachers, please spread the word to them. A lot of our fall and winter are going to be focused on really getting these out and in classrooms. So that is our biggest goal, is if it actually gets used by students and in front of students. So thank you all for your time, and
Yeah, so thank you on behalf of the JASC Legacy Center and Tadaima 2021 and Journey Chicago, which is a project of the Chicago Cultural Center. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Awesome. Bye, everybody.